Welcome back to A Year of Final Fantasy, and today we're going to be talking a little bit about Star Wars in Final Fantasy, specifically a few characters known as Biggs and Wedge, obviously if you've read the title of this video, and they appear in the series almost recurring as much as, say, the Highwind name, possibly even Sid. So now if you've been following this series for a little while, you'll know that Star Wars does come up from time to time, and it's not an accident. The developers of Final Fantasy, specifically Hironobu Sakaguchi and the others, are incredibly heavily influenced by Star Wars, like anyone else in the media industry. And for the single person out there that doesn't know what Star Wars is, just a very brief overview for completeness sake, is that Star Wars is essentially a science fantasy world, or I guess universe is more appropriate to say, and it's filled heavily with a number of kind of soap opera traits, family turmoil, that type of thing, I guess. And you're going to hear the word space opera being thrown around a lot, and that was almost defined by Star Wars. At least it came into prominent pop culture with Star Wars, although there had been other stuff before then, like Dune, that pushed that theme forward, I guess, if you want to think of it like that. They're larger-than-life characters, a kind of magic in the universe called the Force, obviously, and the rebellions fighting against an evil empire, and that's really the big thing that Final Fantasy takes away from it, is that Empire Rebellion thing. And there's a group of ancient magical knights, sometimes infused with technology. You can draw some instances back and forth there from Magitech and stuff, but other than that, the big thing that we're going to focus on is that kind of small group of rebellions fighting against a big evil empire. Of course, whenever that happens, you normally have one or two main characters that are tied in some way to the big main final character, and that obviously also is Star Wars related. So hopefully a lot of that description of Star Wars does sound familiar to you if you're a Final Fantasy fan. And specifically, we are going to be talking about Biggs and Wedge today, who actually aren't super big characters in the Star Wars mythos, I guess, but they've been explored through expanded material. Or I guess I should say at this time they've been explored through the, what do they even call it now, Legends expanded material, whatever that is, before Disney bought the Star Wars name and completely wiped it from the face of the earth and started their own expanded universe. So we'll go over the characters a little bit. Biggs comes from Biggs Darklighter, which was a childhood friend and kind of friendly nemesis that was always trying to one-up each other from Luke Skywalker as pilots. Eventually Biggs was recruited into the Empire and eventually defected, becoming a member of the Red Squadron of X-Wings of the Rebellion, eventually going down in a blaze of glory during the Battle of Yavin by none other than Darth Vader himself. I mean, if you're gonna get killed, why not get killed by Darth Vader, right? So Wedge, on the other hand, is also part of the Rebel Alliance and has fought during the Battle of Yavin as well with Biggs and all the others. And after the Battle of Yavin, they formed the Rogue Squadron of Starship fighters for the Alliance, and he himself was one of the best pilots. Several video games about Rogue Squadron were created to critical acclaim as well, which hopefully you've played a little bit of, or at least heard of. They are very, very good games. Not RPGs at all, but still very good. So that's a little bit about the history of Biggs and Wedge in Star Wars. Let's talk about Final Fantasy. Since Final Fantasy II, though not every game does, it does exhibit some Star Wars-esque qualities, normally with the Rebellion and Empire, but other forms of it can be seen as well. Either way, our two characters of Biggs and Wedge begin in Final Fantasy VI with Vix and Wedge, which is really weird. It has to do with the translation of the Japanese text to English, and it was a really kind of weird back and forth because over here we have Biggs and Wedge in Star Wars. We don't know how prominent those characters were, and the people that were translating from Japanese to English, the character for the V and B looked the same in that aspect. I don't know, you can make up all these scenarios in your head, but we had Vix and Wedge, and eventually in later translations, the games were changed to Biggs and Wedge. Fun fact here though, Biggs is actually the superior to Wedge in the games where they take on the roles of military personnel. It's a weird thing, I've never thought about it, but yeah, that's what happens. So I'll talk a little bit about the more prominent games that the characters are in as well. Just let it be known though that they are referenced in most of the Final Fantasy games, even the ones before Final Fantasy VI, if they themselves had a remake, or they're at least nodded to in some form or fashion in most of the games. So in Final Fantasy VI, like I said, we're first introduced to these characters alongside of a nameless girl fighting for the Empire, and Biggs and Wedge basically get wiped out in pretty short order. There's some kind of funny references in Chrono Trigger and the people that made Chrono Trigger from this Final Fantasy VI reference, which I'll get into here in a little bit whenever we talk about the tertiary games. But in Final Fantasy VII, that's the next game we see them in. They are more in their Star Wars form, fighting against the Empire in this particular situation, though not necessarily representing the movie counterparts, at least physically. These versions are pretty major in terms of Final Fantasy. As you get to know them a little bit more than you would in the other games, they have some more ambitions, and they're referenced pretty heavily throughout the Final Fantasy VII series, and it seems that in the remake we're going to get even more of them, which is honestly, I'm happy for. In Final Fantasy VIII, they're Galbadian soldiers, which are the quote-unquote bad guys in the game, In this game, they once again work for, like I said, that empire, but they're played for laughs, a little bit more levity early in the game, but they are mentioned and actually appear throughout the game in one form or another. There's nothing about them in Final Fantasy IX as far as I can tell. In Final Fantasy X, they appear as minor characters which are recruitable for your Blitzball playing if you're into that kind of Blitzball side quest stuff. Otherwise, that's pretty much it. In Final Fantasy XII, they appear kind of, which is really weird because Final Fantasy XII is the most Star Wars-like out of everything, but they're known as Gibbs and Dewig, which are kind of anagram-like names. I know Gibbs is not necessarily an anagram, but they are Arcadian soldiers, and even within the game, they are incredibly obscure characters, so take that as you will. It's really weird because Final Fantasy XII is really like Star Wars, so I don't know, that's weird. In Final Fantasy XIII, they appear in name only. Even then, it's not apparent really, but the B&W outfitters that you'll see with these retail networks and stuff where you get your different equipment, that is Biggs and Wedge, B&W. Kind of weird, something that I just learned myself is actually their logo in the game is V&W, possibly pointing to the VIX, GAF, or whatever you want to call it in Final Fantasy VI. So that, I don't know, that's kind of weird. In Final Fantasy XIV, they are incredibly huge characters, probably the largest in terms of main story conflicts. You see them over and over again throughout the cutscenes of the main story, helping the man Cid himself with all kinds of mechanical contraptions and different stuff that they have to do. So they are a huge part of that game. In Final Fantasy XV, Biggs and Wedge are part of Arenea's High Winds gang. Arenea being the Dragoon of the game, the High Wind actually of the game as well. And you can usually talk to them and even buy stuff from them. I don't know if that's, I don't know, that would be a reference to maybe Final Fantasy 13, but that's probably stretching it, as you can buy stuff from lots of people. So anyway, looking back before Final Fantasy VI and remakes and remasters, we have Final Fantasy featuring Biggs and Wedge as random names for the Thief class, and in Final Fantasy IV specifically, in the after years, you actually learn that Biggs and Wedge from the original game are the two soldiers that question Cecil and his motives as being part of the Red Wings in the very beginning of the game. So that's kind of weird. They also themselves appear in the after years part of the game. And just because this video can't go on indefinitely, I'm going to list the remaining games, maybe talk just briefly about them if you want to track down more information for yourself. So Biggs and Wedge appear in Final Fantasy IV The Interlude and the Crisis Core PSP game as machine names, so they aren't themselves in there, but their machine names are, I don't know, it's weird. And they're referenced in Dirge of Cerberus. They appear as cards in Triple Triad. They're actually in Final Fantasy X-2, again as Blitzball members. They appear in Lightning Returns. They're in Final Fantasy Tactics, Tactics Advanced, Final Fantasy Dimensions 1 and 2. They're in Record Keeper. They're in Brave Exvius, Mobius, World of Final Fantasy Trading Card Game, Chocobo's Dungeon 2 on the PlayStation, Final Fantasy Fables Chocobo's Dungeon on the Wii. They're also referenced in Chrono Trigger, which is actually funny, what I talked about earlier, because in the beginning of Final Fantasy VI, they basically get wiped out by this crazy snail worm thing. And the developers of Chrono Trigger said that they got teleported into that dimension from that crazy snail that they encountered at the beginning of Final Fantasy VI. I don't know if you want to think of it as canon or not, but I don't know. It doesn't really hurt anything. And they also are in Kingdom Hearts 2 as well. Whew, okay, that's a lot of Biggs and Wedge. It's a fairly long video, all things considered. I thank you so much for watching this Year of Final Fantasy video, and we're coming up on the end of the month. This month and the next month are hectic months. You can expect 2 more episodes this month, hopefully bringing us up to 8 total in the month of Carbuncle here in November, and in December we're going to be entering that month with themed Ivalice games, so all the tactics games, and even some other stuff that I may talk about that you may not initially think is a Final Fantasy kind of deal. So thank you again for watching, sharing, subbing, all that good stuff. It helps me more than you can possibly know. Even if you hate this, give it a thumbs down, doesn't matter, helps me in the algorithm. I appreciate you interacting with me in any way possible. Thank you all, and as always, until next time, Crystal Warriors, keep on gaming.